Ladies and gentlemen, guys and girls, welcome back to another episode of the Age of Warfare podcast. So, I am Centurion Natchez Maximus, and of course, as always, my right hand man, the Gate Aiden Cordier. So, as always, before we get started, we're gonna be, how you doing today, my brother? How is everything going on?
I'm good.
Mhm.
I've been on holiday, so I had a few beers last night, so
All right.
trying to get myself centered. But yeah, been having fun. As you can see by the lack of sleeves on my shirt, the weather is quite warm out here at the moment.
Yep.
But yeah,
So,
generally things have been ticking along nicely. How about you?
I've started writing my next solo novel. I started this week, so I'm back into the writing routine. And yeah, so and besides that, it's hot out here. So that's another thing. It's hot out here, and we're just getting ready for the brunt of hurricane season. So that should be fun. Hopefully,
yeah.
not too fun. If you get
Yeah.
so, yep. So anyway, before we get started, a little disclaimer here, guys. The plan was originally to start we were going to start a series about Alexander the Great and Philip II. We were with and all that. We were going to do a 3-part series. We were supposed to start today, but unfortunately, our partner Nee is not feeling well at all. So, sending good vibes to Nee. Hopefully, he gets better, and hopefully by our next show, we could start talking about Alexander the Great, because we got lots to talk about with that. So, sorry about that, and well, hopefully he'll be better. But today we got a fun topic anyway, and it's one that the Brits and the French are familiar with. It's called the 100 Years' War, or what I like to call it, the Joan of Arc, war. Joan of Arc was very popular.
Yeah, for the French.
Yep.
Until we killed her.
So basically, the 100 years. So let's set the scene here. The 100 Years' War was basically a conflict between England and France. And I first learned about the 100 Years' War guess where I'm going with this? We're going to go with Age of Empires 2, the Age of Empires 2 Joan of Arc campaign, when the British laid siege on the city of Orleans. Yeah, so Joan of Arc was nothing but a peasant girl, and she led the French army to break the siege against the British. And from the year 1337 to 1453, you had the 100 Years' War, which is why they call it the 100 Years' War, because it lasted over 100 years.
It's one of those interesting conflicts where it's obviously it's longer than 100 years, but it isn't a single conflict. So for example, if you imagine the Second World War, obviously you have the two major parts of the Second World War. You have the European theatre, and then you have the Eastern Theatre as well. So obviously the US, when Pearl Harbor happened, they then start fighting that. But obviously the conflict in the East in World War II started with in 1937 or 6 with the Japanese invading China. And that then got subsumed into the war. It started off as a separate conflict that then became part of this whole world war. 100 Years' War was a very similar thing to that, where it was conflict between two houses that then broadened out, and it was many, many years of conflict. That there were gaps in it that were sort of like 10, 15 years of no fighting. Well, no fighting. It's medieval periods, there's always fighting, but there was not really the war going on as such. And part of that is why it's called the 100 Years' War, is to do with, it was a French historian in the 1820s who came up with it, of this thing, and the name just stuck because the period's so amorphous. Yes, it isn't 100 years. There's lots of conflicts all grouped together, but it's roughly 100 years. So it's just a way of grouping those conflicts between the major British monarchs and the major French monarchs and their houses, and trying to sort out what France and England actually were. It's like, this is how France and England were formed. It took 100 years to fight it, because essentially that area, especially it's a long time. So it's like nearly 1,000 years after the Romans, but
yeah,
the land still hadn't settled down into like whose was whose and what countries were, because countries weren't a thing back then. It was
no, they were all kingdoms and duchies and all that.
yeah. So
And or in the case of Ireland, earldoms in Ireland.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
So I wanted to share a screen. So to basically share a map of what the part of the world looked like in 1314. So you basically got France. You know, you got France here, England, the Duchy of Brittany, which we have to touch on. Then you had the Burgundians. So basically, you know, this was how it looked before the 100 years war started. So that's basically the map of Western Europe before the major war started. So basically, Aiden, why was the war even a thing? Why did the war even start? You know, what was it? Just pure greed of the British, or was there more to it?
There's the whole thing that is, as I said, obviously it's lots of long-running conflicts that became a bigger thing. If you go right the way back to the collapse of the Roman Empire, after that you get these kingdoms forming, and then you have after that what's essentially France, what's essentially Germany, and then the bit in the middle, which is your Belgium, your Netherlands, and that little bit Burgundy, obviously, as part of that of this area, and then you have Britain. They're still very connected as places, because if you think that the centuries of the Vikings was about the 800s, and that's where Normandy then becomes a thing from that, and that starts forming. Obviously, then the Normans then go along and go, cool, we're going to have Britain. So they come across, Battle of Hastings, they win, and they then spend the next century or so stabilizing the British Isles into what they want as well. A lot of the conflicts in Ireland, even to this day, are descended from the Normans trying to conquer Ireland as well. So you have this. So they've then got settled. Yes, there are still conflicts going on, but that's when they've got settled. But because of that, they also owned Normandy through right of fealty. Even though they were monarchs of the British Isles and people owed fealty to them, as the rulers of Normandy, they owed fealty to the monarch of France because it was technically French monarchical land. So there were lots of arguments between that as the Dukes of Normandy were trying to expand their territory. That then escalates, and the French monarchy was actually crap. Basically, they couldn't hold their territory. It wasn't until you get later with the Albigensian Crusade that you actually get France becoming France. The southern part of France was a separate thing to the northern part of France. And you see these different areas. So obviously on the map that you've shown, those big chunks of areas, they're all different dukedoms. It's not. Don't think of it as France, England, Spain, Germany, because they're all the bits on the edges. And then obviously you've got Italy, and then a little bit of the Swiss Alps, which is complicated. We'll avoid that. So you've got these areas, and they're all involved in this to a certain extent. But it's those different dukedoms, and which of those dukedoms are going to be under that monarch properly. So the British monarch was like, well, I'm a monarch. I don't want to swear fealty to a French monarch. They're my lands. And it's not that this is England, this is France. I want some French land. It wasn't France. It was their land to start off with. So there were arguments over who they should swear fealty to because they're at the same level. And obviously the British lands and the French lands, England and the rest of the British Isles were more powerful than France at that point. So they were able to turn around and just go, no, we're not going to swear fealty to you. It's our land. It's off. And obviously the French didn't take too kindly to that. So it started the war. And then we spent 100 years kicking them 6 ways from Sunday until Joan of Arc came up right at the end. Which is the other reason the 100 Years' War gets grouped together as a thing, and it was by a Frenchman, because the French lost that conflict all the way until the very end when Joan of Arc comes up. So obviously from the 1820s is when the nations are properly forming, and it's part of their national history, you want to group all of the things that you lost into something where you won and have the capstone of it being where you won. So the French technically won the 100 Years' War, but that's because they included all of these last 100 years worth of wars where they got their asses handed to them into that one conflict, so they could say that they won, because obviously isn't that if you want to say that you won a thing. So the War of 1812 for the US is a very similar thing. Is the US lost if you look at the objectives that happened, the US lost that. But in US history teaching, the US won that. Well,
so here we go. Here we go again with the bias.
Yeah, so you ended up with, this is the thing, obviously, we've been talking about for so many episodes, is this bias in the history teaching is that, technically, Britain won the War of 1812, but it's, when you look at the end state, it went back to how it was before. There was conflict, and then it all went back to how it was before. The 100 Years' War was very similar to that, in the state of, it all, once it finishes, it then goes back to pretty much what everyone thought it was before the conflict happened. So there was no real change in hand of lands. Normandy, I suppose you could argue, would be part of the big change, but apart from that, it was just those slight differences that happened, and it's similar to the War of 1812. So it then becomes into a national consciousness thing of, well, we did this, we did that, but it wasn't a we and a them. It's all the same people at that point in history, because countries didn't actually exist.
And then the War of and then there was one more thing in the War of 1812. The Spanish control over Western Florida weakened. That's when the United States started to get control of Florida from Spain.
It was, the knock-on effect had absolutely nothing to do with the war that was being fought.
Yeah,
it was all of that stuff that happened that enabled.
And then eventually, eventually that was the gateway to the United States eventually getting Puerto Rico. In the late 1800s, that was the gateway from Florida to Puerto Rico. I
didn't realize that. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that was the gateway. Without Florida, we wouldn't get to Puerto Rico. Spain would still have control of Puerto Rico. Yeah, so another interconnection. Another interconnections. And then, of course, you had the French-American War as well. The French-American War.
Why the US went to war with France, when France basically is the reason that the US even exists. It's like the US would have lost this war of independence without France. Like, why are you fighting them? Like, they're the guys who helped you out. That'd be like us going to war with you guys. Like, why? You helped us out in the Second World War. We helped you out. We helped you out in the Middle East.
I don't get it. Well, I mean, so a little bit of a tangent here. If you play Medieval 2 Total War, especially 2, I think you could do it in 1 as well. As the British, you actually have to take out the French. The game needs you to take out the French if you play as the Brits. First you take out Scotland, of course, in Medieval 2 Total War, and then you take over Ireland, but then you have to go south into France. I mean, you could always go east to Denmark, but obviously to win the game, you got to take out France to win.
And
so here we go with Creative Assembly doing a wonderful job recapturing the 100 Years' War in game format.
It makes you realize why you've got the reasons for war. So when you look at Europe as a whole, you've got the big blocks. So you've got Germany, roughly. Then you've got so let's go from west to east. You've got Britain up in the northwest, doing the British Isles thing. Then you've got up in the north, you've got Scandinavia, and they're doing their thing. You've then got France and Spain, and then you get central, and you're doing Germany and those various areas. And then it goes to the east, and you've got your Poland and as one of the major hubs there. And then obviously when you get into the fourth part of it, you'll get into Ukraine, Belarus, that sort of area. So Europe doesn't stop to the Ural Mountains. People forget that a large portion of Russia, in fact, the majority of the population of Russia is actually European. It's a European state. It's just that they've got more connection to the east because they expanded that way in the 1600s to capture all the stuff in Siberia and going all the way to Kamchatka, and then getting obviously the the whole Portland that they needed the other side of China. But you've got these big blocks, and so it's trying to get those blocks sort of settled. Of each one of them wants to have an area of land where they can sustain that population. And one of the things with Britain is, being an island, we've always needed to have some sort of connection to the continent. So if you look through the 100 Years' War and trade at the same time, there's massive trade with the Netherlands, or that countries around there, and up into sort of Denmark. And that's our route through. Partly because we were generally at war with France, so you didn't want your trade going through France. However, obviously, owning land in France, like Gascony, for example, and certain areas in southwest France, obviously that's a lot of port trade, because it's the western coast, it's the Atlantic coast of France. That then goes down into Spain, obviously, and at that point, Spain was controlled by which caliphate it was now, but it wasn't a European Spain. It was part of the sort of Islamic kingdoms. It was the edge of those areas, and you had that war going on at exactly the same time. Now, if you even go into, say, the Crusades, one of the reasons for calling the Crusades was because England and France were busy killing each other's nobles so efficiently and so quickly that the Pope got really annoyed about it, because it was just making Europe really bad at defending itself, because all of the soldiers were just dying by them killing each other. So part of the reason for the Crusades was, right, we'll get all these young nobles that don't have land to go and fight somewhere else. And if they're fighting over in the Middle East, they're not fighting in Europe, and then Europe can become more prosperous. You move those people that can do the warfare stuff elsewhere, and then that can be dealt with elsewhere. Which is one of the big things that people forget about the Crusades is that 100 Years' War and the Crusades are so massively interlinked. It's actually part of the 100 Years' War, the Crusades, when you really think about it. Is the entire point of that is to try and stop the monasteries who were making a lot of money for the church in France and on the south coast of England. Obviously, the French invaded England multiple times. To get that is obviously where you're going to go and take stuff from. Well, monks generally aren't going to go around fighting back, and monks generally had a lot of stuff. So if you're going to go and nick a lot of stuff, do what the Vikings did. And the people that were fighting and the ethos of that came from exactly those same Vikings. Once they've got lands, it's the same people, the same ethos that they had behind that for those invasions. And the Pope just basically wanted money and wanted to stop destroying his churches. So he went, just go and fight the Muslims, please, and then let's make a bit of money from it. And that's essentially part of it. Well, it's the whole crossbow thing as well, in there as well. So I'm sure you've come across the crossbow thing. You know the crossbow thing?
What was that?
The crossbow thing, where the crossbows.
Yes. Yep.
That didn't work particularly well. It's sort of like everyone turned around like, yeah, okay, mate, go away.
Yes.
We're still going to use them.
Interestingly enough, the French used the crossbows, while the English they still used the longbows. They didn't use crossbows in England. They were experts in the longbow. There was a word for the yeoman. The yeoman.
Yeah. So a yeoman is my family history. If you go back on one side of my family, one of them was a yeoman. So one of the things in medieval period is general time with peasants. However, peasants were just it's like saying working class these days, or yeah. So it's a group rather than a specific individual. So there were different levels within that. So a yeoman was one of the top levels. He was your equivalent of, these days, you'd probably say, I'm trying to think about this. Right, imagine a person who they own 2 or 3 houses, they're a landlord, they've got a decent job, they're retired, they're on sort of like a couple of town committees and things like that. An average person who's got money, but is at that top end of things where they're in houses that they can rent out. They've got a stake in what's going on. They've got some stuff as well. And realistically, if it falls on hard times, they're not going to be the one that is starving in the streets type of person. That's the level of a yeoman. But also that came with obviously knights. Being part of being a knight was an obligation to serve in the militaries at the time. Of like you had to give 40 days of service to the monarch that you swore fealty to. This is one of the reasons of with the French monarchs, because England didn't want to be, the English monarchs didn't want to be dragged into every war that France wanted to wage, because technically the lords of Normandy had to, with their swearing fealty, give 40 days of military service to France. It was a massive thing all the way through. It's why you end up with military contracts. This is how the development of militaries comes about as the 100 Years' War. It's a major component of this. So you end up with the yeoman being that end of society. Is you then had to be do all of the good things, and that included the being good at using a bow. Now, using a bow was just for hunting originally, but we realised how good they were, and that then became part of British law, that you had to use the bow. You had to go to the butts on a Sunday. I used to test the bow. Like the butts in our town is about 5 minutes walk from my house, and literally the electrical box that controls the street lights in that area is painted with medieval arches, and it's outside the church, and it is still called the butts to this day. That's where you'd go and you'd train with the bows. Training with a bow takes an insane amount of time to be able to get good at it. It's the reason that we were able to is because it was tradition that we kept up. So the French didn't have that level of tradition with the bow. So Welsh longbowman was the pinnacle, really, of our longbows. But what the French would then do is and this is where the Swiss come into it, is gather in those mercenaries to use their crossbows. Because a crossbow, you can get very good at a crossbow training, but it's like a gun. If you hand someone a gun and you just say, point that end towards the bad people, and then you pull this bit, and then you've just got to keep putting stuff in the bottom so that it goes out that way, make sure that it's on this setting so that it works. Like, you could train someone to use a gun that quickly. Crossbow, very similar. Put the bolt in the top, pull the thing back, and then point it at the bad person and do that. Whereas with a longbow, theoretically, put the arrow on the thing, pull the thing back, and point it at the person you want to get rid of. However, the technique to be able to make that work is a lot harder. Whereas obviously with a crossbow, it's built into the thing. That technique's already built in. So when you pull the string back, you've just got to line the thing up and it does its thing. Whereas with a longbow, you need to know what angle you're pulling it at, how far you're pulling it out, the draw that you're going to use, the angle of the arrow that you're going to fire at the end of it. It's not just a point and click type of thing. We could only use that as we used even Napoleonic Wars. There was actually a movement in Napoleonic Wars because longbows were better than muskets, even in that late period, the early 1800s, obviously. And there was even a movement to have regiments of longbow, but we didn't have enough of the training to train for such a young age as well, which is why it's become so iconic and part of British consciousness, really, of what longbowmen really are. As well. It's more a way of life than the things that you are, which is kind of insane if you think about it.
Now, I was looking at something. I was as you were talking, I was looking up Joan of Arc. We're going to be talking about her next. I found an interesting article about 2 years ago where, and I'm going to share it on the screen here, where in Nunda's Grove Reader, Joan of Arc is going to be portrayed as non-binary. So I kind of found that very interesting, and I found it very interesting that London, England, is even putting up Joan of Arc because Joan of Arc was an enemy of the British. So I just found that very interesting that
it's one of those weird things. Obviously, training her as non-binary makes sense because that was how she got where she was
right.
People couldn't tell that she was a girl.
Exactly. Even
so, portraying her as non-binary actually makes more sense.
Right. Right. No, I never meant it in a bad way. I just found it interesting that
Yeah.
that they're putting it up as non-binary, and I'm saying to myself, wow, that's actually pretty accurate. That's
Yeah,
actually pretty accurate.
it's one of those things of
Mhm.
we think of things like a non-binary and all of the stuff that goes around that, especially when you get into politics and stuff, is a new thing. It's not a new thing. It's really old. You go back to the Romans, that was a massive thing for the Romans and the Greeks. They were constantly talking about that type of stuff as well. And it's that when you add it to, say, these bits of history, you go, oh, well, they're adding it. Well, they're not. As we've said, it's like, actually, no, that is exactly it. That is literally just the word to describe what happened.
Right. But then, here's something interesting I'm going to show you. Then there was a mini-series called Joan of Arc. There was a TV mini-series in 1999, and they portrayed her as a woman with long hair. Yeah, this the poster right here.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting that when they made that particular miniseries, they portrayed her as a complete woman. Even though even though back then there were doubts whether she was actually a female or she was actually male.
And one of the big things was that she kept her hair short on purpose because it was
right.
I don't know if you pull up the bowl cut thing that they used to have in there.
Yeah, the bowl cut, right?
Ridiculous bowl cut that they had.
Yeah, but the funny thing is, on this poster, she has long hair, like she's a proper woman, which I have to say is not very accurate. Now you got this picture, AI generated. This kind of looks more accurate with the bowl cut, like you were talking about.
Yeah, it's you'd think one, but you'd take 2 takes to be 100% sure of yourself.
Yeah.
Type of thing. It's Joan of Arc's a very interesting character in history. It was a very how to put this? It was a political move. It wasn't a military move. The French had been having their arses handed to them for so long that they needed someone. Their morale was just so bad.
Yeah.
They needed someone to rally around, and people started rallying around Joan of Arc, so they picked her. They didn't like her. The French hated her to the point of they burnt her at the stake. They actually killed once they were finished using her for their purposes. They killed.
Yeah, that's funny.
She was literally a schizophrenic teenager taking a lot of drugs. That's what she was. It was. Her visions, and some research has been done to this. I haven't looked into it for a little while, but nuns used to eat a lot of rye bread. Rye is slightly easier to grow, easier to store. It's got some benefits over wheat. It's just easier to deal with, type of thing. And then the bread lasts for a bit longer. The problem is when rye bread goes starts going mouldy. Obviously, if you've got nothing to eat, we've all done it when we've got nothing left to eat. It's day before payday, and the only loaf of bread that we've got has got a bit of mould, so we take the slice out that's got mouldy, throw it in the bin, and we get a slice that's mould. That's still technically got some of the mould in it. It's fine with white bread. It's like humans can deal with that. It's just don't eat the visible stuff, but you're still eating the mould. Now with rye bread, it's very different because that's LSD. That's how you make LSD. So she was stoned, so badly stoned because she was poor, living in a monastery. So she was eating the ends of the bread, the old stuff, the stuff that had gone mouldy, which was the mouldy rye bread. And it's a lot of the visions of the medieval period. If you look into it, they can be traced to mouldy rye bread. If you look at the climate at the time and the amount of harvesting as well. But what the French lords wanted was they wanted something that the troops could rally around. And being a very religious time period, you want a figure that people want to follow because they're religious. You see this in the southern states. You get these religious figures in churches that people will support, even when they do horrendous things. That people support them because it's their religion. It takes a lot for people to then go, no, this person is actually a bad person because they're supporting because of the religious aspect. Islam has it as well. take any major religion where people are really, really devout. You've got to get this. And Joan of Arc was that for, well, say Catholics, but Protestantism hadn't come along yet. So Christianity at the time she was that figure. She's come along with a vision. You're going to win. God has told me that. They believed that, and then she was used as that figure at the front of the army. The problem was she was very divisive as well, which is why she ended up getting killed afterwards. All they wanted to do was use her to make the army have a lot better morale, because the French army wasn't bad. It was often used badly. When we Crécy and Agincourt, when we destroyed them, that was just literally tactics. It was, they decided to run a lot of heavily armored knights through boggy ground. Like, it's just stupid. Like, they did it because that's what they'd always done, and we just turned around and went like, well, that was stupid. Let's just shoot it. Well, okay, we've won. It's like, if you look into them, it's not like half of those battles are not so much us winning the battle as the French using it when they didn't need to. So they needed to look for something to get them to win, to break that mold, and that's where Joan of Arc then comes into it. Of someone has this brilliant idea of going, well, actually, you really think about it, like, has the visions, and you can tell that it was a propaganda thing, and it was just for that, because if they really revered her as a religious figure, they wouldn't have burnt her at the stake the moment that they won that part of the 100 Years' War. They would have revered her, and made her an abbess, or given her a prominent position somewhere.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, because she is considered a patron saint she is considered a patron saint of France. Honor the defender of the French nation in the siege of Onnes. So they do consider her a saint. So I mean, it's funny because
dichotomy of that where they do that, but at the same time, it's like, well, you killed her for being that.
Right. They were, and she was considered an early feminist and a symbol of freedom of independence. So she was one of the earliest feminists in the world.
Which is what led them to burning her at the stake with those feminists are witches. You burn them at the stake. That was the thinking of the time of those thoughts. They liked her when she was working for them, but when she carried on with those ideas, they were like, no, we don't want to completely change how our country's run. We just wanted to win this war. Thank you very much. Go away. Shut up. No, you're still speaking. Right, I'll burn you at the stake. So they handed her over to us. And we held a trial. We turned around and went, no, it's definitely a witch. Let's give it back to the French to deal with. And they had their own little trial and went, no, 100%, yeah, definitely the British were correct on this. And then they burnt her at the stake. And it is those early levels of feminism that come into it, which are, at that point, that's just basic equality stuff of, like, can women just, own land that they own? It's like, oh, what's this horrendous thing? Owning land when you're not a male that's at the top of the rich list? Oh, what horrendousness is this? Go away, stupid peasant girl. And that was their attitude at the time. But as I was saying, there's lots of stuff that came out of the 100 Years' War. Is obviously she's was one of the early feminists because she was, and those ideas, they don't go away. As you said, obviously she's a patron saint because you can't put it's Pandora's box. You can't put it back in the box once you've unleashed it. They used it what they wanted to, but they couldn't put all of those ideas back, and it's molded France into what it is today as well. It's a really interesting period in history because people focus on it being 100 Years' War, but it's not. What that war created and the things that happened throughout that war, what people thought about, and how to change those things is what molded and shaped European society forward from that point. Obviously, Joan of Arc is a clear example. She said it's like she's been portrayed as non-binary. Well, that's correct because she was. That's how she got there. She was an early feminist. Well, she was. That was the thing. These relevant things to today are coming out of this time period as well. It's not just a bunch of guys on a field stabbing each other. It's the thought processes behind it.
So now that we talked about the 100 Years' War, do you think that it has an effect on modern society to France and England is still? Do you think there's still some hard feelings between France and England ever since the 100 Years' War?
It's one of those weird ones of countries have their jokes between each other. When you're not part of those two countries having that, it's like two friends joking with each other.
Right.
When they joke and they say something horrendous, and if you were from the outside and it was two people who didn't know each other, you'd be like, "Oh, well, that's fighting words. A fight's going to happen." But when it's mates, you're like, they're going to say something horrendous to the other person, but there's going to be context behind it. A lot of the insults between Britain and France that we bring out when we go are hyper nationalistic when we talk is not that we're hyper nationalistic. It's a persona that we put on just to have a bit of banter. So the French call us roast beef is what it translates as, because what we ate, and we call them frogs from eating frogs' legs. And it's those things that were, as part of our society, it's about the food culture. It's an easy way of differentiating. And we use that as insults, but it's a jokey insult. It's not something that you'd say and then it'd start a bar fight type of thing. It's one of those jokey ones. It's brought us closer together because, as I said at the beginning, is those territories were both French and English. Is the way that we think about it now. But at the time, those concepts didn't exist. They were the monarch owned these lands, this monarch owned that land. So it's one of those parts of shared history that we were using a jokey context, and it will be brought up when there's issues. So, for example, one of the modern political issues would be the camp at Calais. This was years ago, obviously, that it was a really headline news. But it's an issue that still goes on with immigration and asylum seekers, part of Europe, part of what led to Brexit. What you saw in the papers was a lot of harking back to this time period of when we were at war with France. Yet you don't have to go much further from that to we put our entire military in northern France to stop them getting destroyed in the First World War. We just stepped up, went in there and stopped that. You have the obviously the Napoleonic Wars is actually more of there's more bits of conflict over that. So I've said before, the way of writing a contract that Napoleon had, Napoleonic Code and all of those systems, come down, is actually one of the reasons why Brexit lasted so long. Is because it was an incompatible set of laws, and that was purposely done by Napoleon. So those conflicts come from actually slightly later, but those later conflicts obviously are born out of this conflict of that. So anything that's a hangover from this conflict is literally because it affected something else later on.
The butterfly effect.
The conflict itself. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's that kind of thought process behind it.
And that's why I love about history so much. You got the butterfly effect. You got one thing, and it has so many legs, like and it flies and it blossoms like a butterfly, and there's so many effects. It's funny because I got this crazy thing that you get the 100 Years' War, right? Then you go to the Napoleon era, then the War of 1812, right? And where America, and then you got, and then it eventually led to the United States becoming what it is today.
If you really think about that time period, no one could have predicted how everything fell out in the First World War. We were allied with Germany until I think it was 1913. It was like literally the year before the war broke out. We were on the side of the Germans. And the people forget that. It's one of the reasons that the US didn't join in with the First World War at that time is because there had so many German immigrants. Like half the newspapers were in German, and they didn't want to go to war with Germany because of, at that time period, it was still early US, where the people had a lot of connection to the places they'd moved from. Whereas nowadays, obviously, the US has its own identity, and people hark back to, oh, my family's from Ireland, Germany, Scandinavia, or whatever. And they'll say those things, but it's not like my parents were. it's like my great grandfather came over, and it's those later 1800s ideas. A lot of that comes out of this early formation in the 13 and 1400s of what we think of now as countries, is that settling of what dukedoms are under which monarch as well. Because I think it was under Victoria we finally stopped claiming Calais was ours. Like Calais was claimed as a British territory really, really late as well. Like I don't know what date it was. Yeah, there's a technicality in that. It was Henry VIII was the last time that we actually was the field of the cloth to gold and that whole incident that we actually went to war with France, and that was directly from the 100 Years' War. It's not included in that because it's later than the end of the 100 Years' War, but it's not that much later. It's like a generation or so later. So you still got these ideas floating around at that time, and we think of the modern countries in the terms of that period just after the 100 Years' War, sort of getting into the 15 and 1600s of these are countries. Yeah, you've got some oddities of certain territories and things like that, but that's where the countries are actually really formed. And then it takes till the 1800s, and in the 1800s is when people literally write down, yes, this is our country, and that's where we get our modern nations from. But when you look at it of where those countries are being formed, that is literally the grandchildren and the children of the people that fight in the 100 Years' War at the end, trying to settle these disputes between these territories. And then that 100 years of stuff is a knockover effect from the Roman Empire, which is just like 1,000 years before that. Of everything. It's that, as you say, it's this butterfly effect of one thing happening, and then it takes until our living memory to see this solidify into a thing.
It's so true, Aiden, that they say all roads lead to Rome, and there's truth to that. I mean, at least in the Western world, all roads do lead to Rome, because don't forget you had the Britons up in the north, Boadicea, and then to the south you had the Gauls, who used to be the French. They were the Gauls.
Which is something that we haven't covered. So Brittany that came up on
Brittany, yes. Brittany.
Yeah. So I'd like you to look up who was king of Brittany, the kings of Brittany during the 100 Years' War, because they've got some fantastic names.
Kings of Brittany in the 100 Years' War. The War of Britain Secession.
It's a separate war. During the 100 Years' War, Brittany wasn't part of France, and everyone forgets.
Yeah, it
was a completely separate country.
It was a separate country.
Like
yes,
Belgium. Yeah.
Yes.
It's got close ties. People speak basically the same language, but it's a different country. But yeah, the names of them are important.
I mean, even now, Brittany is, even though it's part of France now, it has its own separate language. Britain.
Yeah. It's a part of the Brythonic languages. So, this even goes to the beer that I'm drinking. I'm drinking Dunbar, which is a Cornish ale. So Cornwall and Brittany actually have more connection between each other than Cornwall and the rest of England, or Brittany and the rest of France. Because they are the sort of like Wales is, separate thing. They're like that, but they were the ones that got subsumed into the greater territories. The Saxons, it was very late that the Saxons actually brought Cornwall into it as part of England proper. And Brittany is the same for France, and it's called Brittany because it was the Britons. It was the clues in the name is that, and this again goes back to the Roman Empire.
In fact, in modern day Brittany, they still speak what they call Britain. Britain, which is like a Celtic language.
Yeah.
You got
Cornish is the same thing. It's very rarely spoken. It's become a bit of a joke phrase saying Mebian Kerno. Because Kerno is Cornish for Cornwall. Mebian Kerno is the independence movement, and it still exists. There's an independence movement of Cornwall that they do not want to be part of the UK. and it's still a thing. And Brittany has the same type of stuff going on, and it's like the Welsh, the Scottish, and the Irish. It's that group of Celtic nations, and they've got that strong Celtic history going through, because they weren't truly conquered by the Germanic peoples who came over and created England from the Angles, or it's obviously the Saxons coming over, but the Franks creating France. They were a Germanic people as well, and that's because they're on the far west reaches. They never truly got completely assimilated. It's part of history later on. And there's a lot of conflict with in the 100 Years' War. And it's when Normandy was expanding in the early 100 Years' War, they Brittany would be siding with the French. It was a separate place, so it would side with the French monarch or the Norman dukes. Because the thing, it wasn't England fighting France, it was the Norman dukes were fighting the French monarch. It was a secession movement. And that's what the 100 Years' War is about. It's not England and France, it's the Norman dukes fighting to secede from France and keep their lands and remain autonomous from the treaty. It was in 900 and something when Normandy was ceded to the Vikings. And that's the core root of that conflict as well. And it's one of the things, like we think of it these days, so it's always England and France. It was never England and France. England just happened to be somewhere that the Norman dukes owned. So that was a territory they used to fight against France. And once they lost areas of Normandy, Gascony, and all the other ones, it then became the only place they had was England. So it became England was fighting France. But it wasn't that. It was the Norman dukes seceding from the French monarch. Mm-hmm. And it just was 100 years of conflict based on, no, we don't want you to be our king. Though we really messed up later in the war. We would have owned France, but we crowned our king in the wrong cathedral. And the French turned around and went, you morons, and then just crowned their king. We were like, crap. You beat us to it. But yeah, it's and that's why Orleans is so important in that, because that was part of that whole thing of, we just assumed obviously Paris, being the capital of the country, as it were, would be the place it would be. But it's actually, so Reims comes into it and Orleans comes into it as major places. But the crowning the French monarch was very, very different to crowning the English monarch, because I'd make a distinction between English and British monarch, because after 1707 it was Scottish monarchs that we had as well, hence the whole stone thing going on.
Right.
But it's the place that we did that became part of London, so our capital city became that. And it's in a lot of countries, the capital city isn't. So by rights, the capital city of the US should be New York. The capital city of Australia should be Sydney. It's not Canberra. There's lots of places. Just UK is one of those places that happen to have its capital city being its major urban hub, and Paris obviously being its major urban hub. But when you actually look into it, traditionally, that's not where you crown the monarch as well. So it was that those traditions that come through made such a difference. And it's why you can tell that the conflict wasn't about land. It's about who swore fealty to and who was in charge of what, because it came down to where the monarch was crowned. Like, that wouldn't be a thing if that wasn't part of the conflict.
Yeah, really interesting. I always wondered, Brittany, it was always that one little area in the corner. I mean, even though today it's part of France, it's like you got France, and then you got Brittany. It's like a whole different part of France. It's like it has, it's like that one special part that doesn't relate to the rest of the country.
Yeah,
it's got that.
It's like to the US, it would be Louisiana. Because Louisiana state law is based on French law. Correct. The same law as the rest of the US.
Correct.
So you always got that weird bit of the country. I mean, there's many weird bits of the US, but the US is quite big. So by rights, it should have more weird places.
So ultimately, what did the Hundred Years' War resolve? Was there any resolution to that particular war? I mean, you figure after such a non-100-year plus war, there had to be some kind of resolution.
So, as I was saying about, it was all about who owned what land and the fealty that you had to give for which lands. And what it ended up through a series of marriages and deaths and various things, and the war itself, obviously, that you ended up with France as we know it now. It was Calais and areas around Boulogne,
Yes.
and it's essentially the north coast of France was the last bit that was fought over, and a lot of that then came in later treaties of we will stop claiming it, we're not going to go to war over this anymore because it's kind of pointless. As I said, obviously some of the claims went into the Victorian era, but that's because they were forgotten about. It's like there's a couple of instances from the Second World War where people forgot to make treaties, and they were still technically at war with Germany in like the 90s because they just forgot to do them. It's that level of, for all practical purposes, this is concluded. However, on the bits of paper and the treaties and for official reasons, it's still technically going on. And it's one of those ways. So the conclusion of it was that France became France. It sort of solidified of, no, this is France. We've all fought together to keep this place, which obviously solidified. But I've said before on several of our podcasts that your identity as a country doesn't come from the country itself. It comes from the pressure from the outside of the country. You think of it, even going back to the Romans, their identity as Romans came from the Celts in the north attacking Rome, and they were like, no, we're going to fight back against this. And so that formation of, no, we are Romans comes from that. France's formation of, no, we are France comes from the 100 Years' War. England as England, obviously, while you've got the whole Anglo-Saxon element, but England starts becoming very centered around because of that Viking invasion. It's this later 100 Years' War of why we talk about England was fighting France, because that's where the country's formed. By the end of it, you had England and France. At the start of it, you just had a bunch of land owned by a bunch of lords. By the end of it, you had, this is England, this is France. We've decided that it's England is trying to take this territory off of France and make it English territory. France is trying to take this territory off of England and make it French territory. It becomes that thing. So it settles down that thing that, like, Germany doesn't have it until after the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, get into the late 1800s with the formation of Bismarck, that it becomes Germany. But there was still this idea of they were the Germans, they were the people, and it's solidifying their country. With France and England, it is the 100 Years' War, is that conflict that creates that from the country. So this is this and this is that, and creates, as I said, like the base jokey insults between the countries come out of that, which shows that that's what it is that forms that these are two separate entities that do these things. And it's during that time, obviously, is when the Norman dukes become monarchs of England, and then spread out and then solidify the England and British Isles are British land. And then that all gets entrenched later on because of so many conflicts. Like we had a civil war in the middle of it. In fact, we stopped fighting the French because we had a civil war instead.
Yes.
The French wouldn't come and fight us.
Yes.
Yep. A part of the War of the Roses is literally because we got bored going to France and nicking their stuff because they wouldn't come and fight us. So we were like, oh, we want to fight someone. So we then ended up with the War of the Roses, which literally, the culminating battle, the Battle of Towton, it was like 5% of our country was on that battlefield. Like, it died. We lost 5% of our male population in a wet afternoon in a field in the north. Like, literally percentage points of our country died. So yeah, clearly we like fighting a little bit, and God knows what would have happened if that had happened in France. as well. Like I could be speaking French today if that had been part of the 100 Years' War. And that's the thing. It was we had internal conflicts. We went away, we did them, and then when we turned around, it's like, oh, there's a country over there. Oh crap, we forgot about that one. Oh well, never mind. That's theirs now.
Yeah.
And obviously, then later on, obviously, as I say, with Henry VIII, things is when we last have a bit of performative politics, as it were, with an attempt to get it back. I think Elizabeth even had a campaign later on, obviously, daughter of Henry VIII, so it's a little bit later as well. But after the Tudors, realistically, it's France and England. If we were going to conquer any part of France, we're conquering France. It's not, that's our territory we're taking back. That's French territory we're trying to take off of them, type of thing. So it's the conclusion of it really is the solidification. This is England, this is France.
Yeah.
This is the laws that give the fealty to this king, and that's that. We've settled all of that now, so then we can deal with that later on.
And one more thing before we wrap it up. There's one more interesting thing I wanted to point out. I think I believe after that war, the borders of England and France never really changed from that point on. There were never really any big border changes ever after the 100 Years' War between the two countries.
So the French, their only real border changes after that were after the Spanish Succession Crisis in the 1700s.
Yeah, but that's with Spain.
And that's with Belgium. In the north, because it was the Spanish Netherlands at the time. So you get the Netherlands and Belgium in those areas. And even then, at the conclusion of that, the borders remain the same. It's just
pretty much. Yeah. And besides Belgium, that was more in the central part of Europe, but they never really had any more conflict with the English when it came to borders.
Yeah. So if you look at the Musketeers, the whole thing behind the Musketeers, we were fighting France. We were fighting against the French, and that's that sort of 16 to 1700s period. But that's part of all of the religious wars that Europe was going through after the rise of Protestantism. Going through, that comes down through Germany into Switzerland and then to southern France and then through northern France, and then fighting against that. But Britain had become Protestant at that point. That's when we were a republic as well. But we didn't have a monarch. It's when we had a monarch and when we were a republic, and then we had a monarch afterwards. So we were still fighting the French. So those conflicts still went on later on, but they were European conflicts that we got involved in. It wasn't England and France specifically fighting over territory in what we now know as France. It was over separate issues, to say, obviously wars of religion. It's the Spanish Succession Crisis of Gibraltar. Actually, that was a blinder that we paid. It's like, what do you want from this treaty? Gibraltar. And everyone's like, why? And no reason, stuff like that. And we're still, literally, it was part of Brexit as well. Massive arguments with Spain over who had Gibraltar, and we got it over a treaty in the 1700s. And it was those later conflicts that came out of that was people siding, but it was, as I said, it was France and England and us joining into European conflicts as well. And it's really interesting that by that point that's why we gave up a lot of the claims to areas in France. By this point, we're saying it's French territory. So really, can we claim it's ours now?
Yeah. So, all right, Aiden. I think that's going to be it for this particular episode. So, obviously, guys, thank you for listening. The plan, hopefully, our next episode will be the beginning. Fingers crossed for me. Get better, knee. Hopefully, we can get you. We can get started on the Alexander the Great series. It's going to be a 3-part series where we talk about the history of Alexander the Great. But we're going to get granular. So we're going to start with Philip II, his father, and we all know how much of a character he was in history. So I'm excited for that. Then we're going to get into what we know about Alexander against the Persians. And then in the third part, we'll talk about what came after Alexander. We had the Seleucid Empire, the Indo-Greek kingdom, and all that.
That's what. Egypt. Now Egypt became what it is, and even India.
India too, northern India. The Punjab.
And
the Punjab region.
Afghanistan, Pakistan, the eastern regions of Iran, and Punjab.
So we got a whole series of shows coming out. We got a whole series. So fingers crossed for Nee. And of course, Nee is also. I want to give an update about the anthology. Far, people have been handing in the works. Things are coming along well. We're still aiming for a date in October release day before Halloween. We're still aiming for that. So how's your story coming along, Aiden, for that?
Work's been a bit of a mess, so I haven't been able to. I was planning to start the finishing writing at the beginning of this week, but I put it off to this weekend. So I'm on holiday at the moment, so I've got this weekend and next week I'll be writing. I was chatting to my editor last night as well, just giving him a heads up of my writing schedule and letting him know. So my story should be done next week. So.
Hey, ¿cómo está, amigo? Friend from Argentina. Yeah, you kind of missed most of it, but don't worry. You'll be able to catch the replay once we go off live. We'll be catch the replay, and this thing will be on YouTube as well. So on the YouTube, so you can check out the replay. Very interesting topic at the 100 Years War with a very interesting war. And it says, did you know in Argentina, Centurion is a fairly common last name? I did not know that.
That's bizarre.
That's bizarre, wow. Yeah. In Argentina, that's a good
awesome random fact.
That's a good nugget of information, amigo. Thank you for letting us know. That's it kind of makes me think Argentina might be the real descendants of the Roman Empire.
There we are. That's an episode.
That's an episode too. We gotta let's see. We see you can bring him in for that one. History of Argentina. Yeah, I mean that's gonna be that'll be a fun topic. This Argentina is like a very interesting country. You know, I always think Argentina could be this dominant force in Latin America, but then it's like once it gets close to the finish line, it slips. It falls on his ass. Huh? You know, it's like. It's got the opportunity to be such a prosperous nation, but then it kind of falls on its butt.
Yeah, especially when they fight us. we had a little bit of a conflict in the 80s.
It's a mix of everything.
Yeah.
Right now Argentina is kind of enjoying themselves because of Lionel Messi and their soccer, or what they call football. So
But yeah, no, definitely that's got to go on a docket of a thing we need to look into. It's a very interesting country.
Yeah. Real hard to box. You got this. But but anyway, my friend, like I said, once we go off live, the video will be on replay. You can catch the replay, so you can catch us from the very beginning. So, like I said, hopefully, next show in 2 weeks, hopefully we get Lee in here. We can start on the Alexander series. That's going to be really fun. Alexander, So, but for now, guys, this is going to be it for this particular show. I have been Centurion Anxious Maximus, and apparently I'm a popular name in Argentina. That's my friend Negate Aiden Cordia, and we will see you next time in 2 weeks, guys. Hopefully, we'll be covering Alexander the Great. If not, we'll come up with something else. Don't worry. We always are. We love history, so we'll come up. So take it easy, guys. Much love. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.